So it's my pleasure to have Henk ter Keurs, Professor ter Keurs, with us today. He's a good friend for many years now. And Henk was born and raised in Holland, in Delft, which is a beautiful city, and then went to another city, which you definitely should put on your itinerary when you go to Europe again, because it's Leiden, and Leiden is a beautiful little town with great canals and atmosphere, and I think the oldest university in Northern Europe. One of the oldest, maybe the oldest. So he went to medical school there and also did his MD and Ph.D. in Leiden. And he did his Ph.D. thesis was on the visual system of the frog. But then he switched to heart, and he did really remarkable work on excitation, contraction, coupling, calcium, and cardiac cell mechanics. And this is what I really am familiar with, is his work on cell mechanics of cardiac cells and trabecula, and the relationship between calcium mechanics and then arrhythmias. And Henk moved from the flats of Holland to the Rockies in Canada, which is quite a transition, and has been in Calgary now for some time as a professor of medicine and medical physiology. He's both a practicing cardiologist and a basic researcher, and received many awards. Among them, an important one, he was knighted by Queen Beatrix of Holland. And he is a he's a knight of the, correct me if I'm wrong, of the Order of the Dutch Lion. Yeah, that's it. So, and further.
Without any further attempt to make me blush.
You succeed every time.
Well, first of all, I would like to thank all of you for a marvelous day. And I would like to thank Dr. Rudy Jorn, not only for a long-lasting friendship, but for the invitation to come here in St. Louis and visit a new place for me. I had to ask the immigration officer which state is St. Louis. I had to fill that out.
Missouri.
She told me.
Missouri.
Yeah, one or two couple. Okay, and then it's a pleasure to talk about a topic that's the same as announced on the title that you have seen on the walls in the building. But I've made the title shorter, expecting that it could be that there are cardiologists or clinical people here. Is that true?
Yeah.
I'm here.
Oh, sorry, I'll say that. I'm happy. I'm a little bit kind of curious guy that may follow from the introduction. And therefore, my curiosity in cardiac function was triggered when I started my work in heart muscle, first by the attempt to look at heart muscle at the level of cells or even below cells, at the level of sarcomeres. And I thought, okay, I'm going to do mechanics work, and I'll try and solve a couple of puzzles left behind by Sonnenberg. Took a little while to get those heart muscles working to the point where I knew that I didn't screw them up. That is about one of three heart muscles. And when you do the job correctly, you find that those muscles are absolutely like beautiful little glass rods in a bath on top of a microscope, and you are sitting there watching that muscle in the diastolic state, totally quiescent. And then when you screw them up, you find that contractile activity starts all over the place, and importantly, those muscles make arrhythmias, complete tachycardias. For a rat at a temperature of 25 degrees, a spontaneous tachycardia in a piece of muscle 3 millimeters long, 120 micron wide, and 60 micron thick at 2 hertz seems to be a ventricular tachycardia. And in no way could I imagine that there would be a little re-entry pathway in a tiny piece of specimen like the one I just described. So I have observed and looked at arrhythmias always with the eye of a fellow in cardiology wondering what the heck is going on. I still do. That's why the title is the title that you find here. Jennifer has given me an intelligence test, and it says, yep, good. Play with this toy and you can describe arrhythmias. Thinking about the possibility that there are clinical people here, I said, well, make a summary. Arrhythmias can be caused by ectopic pacemaker tissue reactivating the ventricle regularly, usually in the presence of norepinephrine drive, and then you have the ectopic pacemaker arrhythmia. Number 2 in the classification would be calcium overload. This says either by drug, too much D.I.J, or by ischemia and then reperfusion, and you will get a calcium overload arrhythmia, which is called triggered arrhythmia since the early 70s, and has for long been considered to be actually a pathological and rare condition. And then number 3 is that there are, of course, 3D pathways in vulnerable myocardium which permit recurrent activation, and that means a trigger is needed to initiate that 3D pathway to conduct an action potential which then will travel in the 3D myocardium in a 3D loop of sustained re-entry of the ventricular tachycardia. And in the worst case, the loop may fall apart into multiple loops, and we will have a ventricular fibrillation, and after that we have nothing anymore, at least the owner of it. And then thinking of the discovery of proteins, I would think that there are probably more mechanisms that may lead to ventricular arrhythmias. But these upper 3 are the ones that are well established, and therefore the most common one is the 3D pathway permitting an action potential to travel along that pathway currently, and thereby reactivating it whenever the threshold is exceeded, that is the case when the action potential is passed for long enough to allow reactivation. And that means that much of that should be treatable with the proper drugs. Well, to my surprise and to many people's dismay, drugs were shown in the CAST trial to be not the best treatment for many of these re-entry arrhythmias. In the CAST trial, the trial was stopped because flecainide and ancanide seemed to kill more people than they saved. And it seems that companies promoting a drug rather see the trial stopped early in that case than at the time of a class action suit later on. And what we are left with as cardiologists now is that we have ICDs, implantable defibrillators, which do work. And if I ask one of my EP colleagues to consider one of my patients for an ICD, he will always bounce the ball back first and say, would you please do a coronary cath? Because if your patient has evidence of frank or oncoming coronary insufficiency, you better fix that before I put a defibrillator in. So non-uniformity of myocardial perfusion is an important element there. And that means that, to my feeling, our rather surgical approach of a conceptually so challenging problem as arrhythmias with re-entry or with triggering or with ectopic activity has become a rather intellectually disappointing result. I would like to see something better. And that means that I wonder whether, and many other people wonder, whether there are novel insights possible. Therefore, I will give you a 3-line case history of something or a case that may lead to novel insights. I didn't write it down because each time I find it hard to write it down. It's an 8-year-old girl in Italy, one of the patients out of Silvia Priori's patient group. 8-year-old, Christmas time, opens her Christmas present and drops dead. She was a member of a family of people who suffer from catecholamine-induced polymorphic ventricular tachycardia. First described by Dr. Kumel in Paris in 78 and later in detail by Leonard in 95. And the bottom line is the children of those families have no concomitant structural cardiac disease. Finding number 2 was by Swan and colleagues who linked CPGT to a site on this chromosome area. Number 3, the groundbreaking work of Priori and nearly simultaneously by Leitinen in Finland. They found a culprit mutation for that disease in the cardiac ryanodine receptor gene, RYR2. Very interesting because that guy belongs inside cardiac cells and all the surface membrane drugs should not be able to reach or barely able to reach. And then in addition to that, Lahav in Israel described CBVT among Bedouins with mutations located in a gene for calcicrestrin, and calcicrestrin is even one more membrane distant from surface membrane drugs, which we used to aim at before the CAST trial. So the calcicrestrin mutation also leads to arrhythmias. Malignant, the group of malignant arrhythmias I'm talking about here kills 1 out of 3 youngsters that die prematurely. So it's maybe not a huge number of people, but it's still a huge fraction of the people dying young. And then, equally interesting, stress-induced ventricular tachycardia has been linked to a mutation of the troponin T gene. And at the end of the talk, you may want to remember this work by Norman et al. In Circ Research a couple of years ago. And what does this boil down to? Well, if you go to the carrier of the CBAC gene, you find a very interesting phenomenon, and that is that people who are carrier of the abnormality show a very interesting abnormal function and arrhythmia on the treadmill, which is reflected in these three panels, and it shows the best here that these people make a ventricular arrhythmia with alternating polarity of the QRS complexes, the bidirectional VT. And I have my thoughts at the end of the talk about the mechanism underlying that. And I want to magnify that same electrocardiogram once more, because the bidirectional VT in the carriers of this disease on the treadmill is a very clear pathognomonic sign of their abnormality and can last for a long time. Is it related to the mutation? Well, it's rather striking to see that when people put mice on treadmills, they find rather, it's not the best copy I have made, but they find rather comparable bidirectional PTs which precede the occurrence of VF in the mouse with, in this case, a mutation at local 4496 on the ryanodine receptor. So it may be time by now to go to EC coupling in most literal sense. That includes the ryanodine receptor, and it includes the contractile apparatus. Now, I'm nearly sure that I don't need to rehash all of this, except quickly, and that is, if you take an EM of cardiac muscle, the striking finding is that myofibrils are accompanied by a wrapping as a stopping around the myofibril or sarcoplasmic reticulum, which makes contact with T tubules, transverse tubules, which carry the action potential in this model into the core of the cell. During the early part of the action potential, calcium currents trigger calcium release from the sarcoplasmic reticulum through the ryanodine receptor. That calcium activates the myofilaments, and then contraction ensues and is immediately terminated by reuptake of calcium and extrusion of calcium by this electrogenic exchange. And I'm going to propose in the coming hour, half hour, that there are three major sources of calcium, two of which are probably involved in the development of arrhythmia. In diastole, the biggest source of calcium is the LSR. That calcium shuttles to the sarcomeres during contraction. So at the time of contraction, the sarcomere contractile filament system is a huge ligand for calcium, and therefore a huge source of calcium that may lead to calcium-dependent events. And that's the theme I'll try to develop. And then for those who love calcium released by the LSR, here you are. These are the players. the ryanodine receptor, one of the biggest proteins in our body, a tetramer of ryanodine molecules with a big cytosolic domain, which regulates opening of the joint calcium channel in the transmembrane domain. The receptor is sensitive to cytosolic calcium multiplied with the sensitivity to luminal calcium, and that sensitivity is modulated by a trio of proteins being triadin, junctin, and calciquestrin. And calciquestrin is a polymer which forms depending upon the calcium level, and which may even dissociate at extreme calcium levels. And that trio regulates sensitivity of this calcium release channel for the internal calcium, and therefore dictates the probability of opening of the ryanodine receptor. So that's background material. I will skip this. That's detail of the junctin, triadin, calciquestrin interaction, which takes place at transmembrane domain 4 of the ryanodine receptor, and thereby is able to modify calcium sensitivity of that receptor. We don't have them yet, but this model by itself says there will be a time that we find mutations of junctin or triadin which cause arrhythmias. Now, about the ryanodine receptor. Where are the mutations that make arrhythmias? Well, they are found in the same place where the skeletal muscle ryanodine receptor shows mutations which lead to two well-known diseases: malignant hyperthermia, known to cook pigs to death on their way to the abattoir, and therefore not very popular among farmers, and core disease, central core disease, another mutation that leads to death by overheating. Malignant hyperthermia occurs in humans, especially when triggered with halothane-like anesthetics. Now take a look in the linearized ryanodine receptor design where the mutations are. There are about 15 at amino terminal end. There are about 18 in the so-called central domain, and there are a series of them in the transmembrane domain, where you would expect mutations that make a channel unstable. In the very same areas, we find the mutations of arrhythmogenic RV dysplasia, in catecholamine-induced polymorphic fanfiction, tachycardia, and the like. And therefore, it seems that there is an important role to these three domains. The first one, in the carboxyl terminal end, is intuitively easy to grasp. The two other ones are a little harder to grasp. So it's therefore interesting to look at work summarized here by Yano in Nature of this year, which says that central domain of the ryanodine receptor molecule interacts with an amino terminal domain by forming a zipper, which makes a tight link between the two domains. And if that tight link exists, the probability of opening of the receptor is low. If that tight link is opened up by number of possibilities, and they are both mutational and acquired, then the channel opens up or has high probability of opening up and calcium leak takes place, and that may be the cause of problems. And there's an abundance of very attractive evidence put forward by the Japanese groups, of which Yano is part, that support this mechanism, and it would be interesting to talk about the structure of the ryanodine receptor to understand that mechanism, but there's no time to do that now. So what I would like to do is go on with group number 2 of the calcium-dependent arrhythmias, and that is the acquired group. And even though it may be carrying calls to Newcastle, I'll give you 3 examples where calcium seems to be very importantly involved in the development of arrhythmias. And that is in what I would like to call the subacute phase of myocardial infarction. That is in manifest congestive heart failure, as we have created in rats, and that is in the original title of the talk of today, in mechanically non-uniform myocardium. So let's move it. Here's the bottom line. Somowski and Hessager in Warsaw and Bordeaux realized that in the subacute phase of an infarct in humans, the Purkinje tissue indicated by the brown dots and purple dots can be the source of ventricular tachycardias. Now that doesn't mean that they rule out re-entry pathways. They identified the existence of triggering spots as being located in the or near the Purkinje network. And always when we talk about re-entry arrhythmia, we always ask, well, that patient has the pathway to begin with. Why does he start acting up? Well, they wondered that it could be the Purkinje network, and using a time-tested surgical approach, they ablated Purkinje tissue in that area and found that it restored normal conduction despite the existence of scar tissue there. So they suppressed recurrent arrhythmias in the heart by eliminating Purkinje tissue. And it's very interesting, therefore, to look at animal work on Purkinje tissue underlying infarct of 72 hours in dog, as has been studied for about 30 years now by Annie Witt, and later with Penny Boyden, and later Penny Boyden and our group. And the first thing we tried to do was to say, well, Purkinje tissue in infarct is spontaneously active, but I don't know anything about AC coupling in that tissue. So let's find out how that might work. Well, Purkinje tissue has no T-tubules, so it must rely on conduction of calcium activity from the surface of the cell to the core by a chemical translation system. So we explored which calcium release elements are present in Purkinje cells of the dog, and in short, we found in green IP3 receptors at the membrane and in foldings of the membrane. We found RIR2 receptors in red throughout the core of the cell, and we found RYR3 receptors in a band spanning about 5 micrometer below the membrane of these cells, creating a fairly complicated meshwork of release sites. And what you can make out of that for normal activation is the following. The action potential starts at the surface membrane. IP3 receptors release calcium, activate the mesh of RYR3 receptors. They release more calcium and thereby activate RYR2 receptors, which then propagated calcium release into the core. And for a normal Purkinje cell, that's quite an acceptable procedure. The bad news is for the cardiac Purkinje cell after an infarct, and there you'll find that in the RYR3 meshwork, calcium waves occur at much higher frequency than in normal cells, about 5 times higher. Even though manifest sparks are only 50% more frequent, Bruno Starfels is writing that, the number of calcium waves in that layer just below the membrane is 5-fold more frequent, as we have published with Penny Boylan and Masanori Hirose has shown in the biophysical meeting in Salt Lake. Now, if there are that many calcium waves traveling just beneath the membrane, fully occupied with sodium-calcium exchanges, it may not be surprising that these Purkinje cells are seriously, spontaneously active, also electrically. So there may be a link between the clinical example a couple of slides ago and the basic observation in dogs. Then example number 2 of an acquired calcium disease, and that is cardiac remodeling after an infarct. We take a rat, we triple ligate the LAD or the left coronary artery, we allow the animal to recover, and just like that, you go from a normal cardiac size of the sham-operated animal to the grossly dilated heart of the animal after an infarct, which covers about 40% of the heart of the LV. Those animals have clear manifest congestive heart failure. And if you then ask, what about calcium handling and what about arrhythmias? Answer number 1 is 83% of the animals has arrhythmias if they have an infarct that big. And what about calcium? Well, let's have a look. We take these hearts, we dissect out trabeculae which run in the right ventricle. I've never obtained one useful muscle in the left side of the heart, and I refuse to work with chunks of meat. They have to be metabolically acceptable, and that's what these preparations are. And they are trabeculae running between the free wall and the bottom of the tricuspid valve attaching to the AV. They are about 150 to 200 micron wide, 100 micron thick, and 3 millimeters long. And you can literally look through them and measure sarcomere length or calcium or force, whatever you fancy. And I told you in normal muscle, the calcium transient is a very pure rise of calcium, very simple monotonic decline, and total silence in between heartbeats. Force is silent in between heartbeats, and sarcomere length measured with light diffraction shows no variation of the median of the whole group of sarcomeres that you observe of more than 1.3 nanometer. So it's close. And that is typical for normal cardiac muscle. Cardiac muscle is quiescent. Now, suppose that you take a twitch like this one, and you put it in a 3D plot, and you line all its bodies up next to it, then you get the top part of this slide, panel A. And you see that in between the heartbeats, the color coding of length shows that there is no variation of length at all. That is true for normal muscle, or even for muscles with an infarct in the heart, but no complications leading to heart failure, small infarct. If you look at muscles from animals with heart failure, it's quite clear that there's a lot of spontaneous activity. The power spectrum of that noise shows a peak at 3 Hertz, and that's the power spectrum of the twitch. The power spectrum of the noise, or the RMS value, shows a clear dependence on external calcium, and that dependence is absent in normal muscle. Normal muscle stays quiescent, so that one can conclude that in animals with heart failure, there's an abnormality of the willingness of the ryanodine receptor, the SR in general, to release calcium, and that willingness is 7-fold bigger in heart failure than in sham-operated muscles or in muscles from animals without heart failure. And that matches the observation that in these animals diastolic stiffness is measurably enhanced, systolic force is measurably reduced, there's clear non-uniformity of contraction, and it must be, or it can very well be, coupled to the arrhythmias which occur in 8 out of 10 of these animals and never occur in sham animals. So it's very likely to make the additional assumption that this abnormality is linked to arrhythmias. Now the last example. The last example is an example that I believe we should graft on clinical work again and say, well, we know that arrhythmias do occur in the diseased heart, in people during angina attacks, during acute myocardial infarctions, and in cardiomyopathy. And we happily accept that preponderance of arrhythmias is linked to electrical non-uniformity in the wall of that heart. And that we find T-wave abnormalities and abnormalities of QT time. So we have a substrate of 4 arrhythmias. What we know little about is that there may be a role for the mechanical non-uniformity which exists in most of these hearts. And that mechanical non-uniformity may contribute to the arrhythmia itself, for example, by perpetuating mechanical non-uniformity or by generating a trigger mechanism for the first beat of re-entry arrhythmia. And as a matter of fact, as a punishment for doing bad experiments, that's the way I got into this field. If you take out a tubercula and in the process you damage it, and that's very easy. If you take a perfect trabecula out, and the thing is running between here and there in my hands, and I poke it with a set of tweezers, it's quite clear that I damaged it. But that trabecula makes arrhythmias. In the best of cases, the arrhythmia is simply caused by the fact that you have to take the trabecula out and it's attached here to a piece of dissected right frontal. And in that case, the standard observation is that we find that contractile transients start at the area of damage after the last twitch of a train of stimuli and travels clearly from here to there, to there, to there, and there, accompanied by a long-lasting contractile event and traveling at a speed that may vary between 0.1 millimeter per second and up to 10 millimeter per second. Really humongous speeds. So that's a damage-induced calcium transient leading to a contractile transient called trigger propagated contraction. Any relevance to that story? Well, yes, here's a typical muscle of that kind. We are stimulating the muscle here with a train of stimuli. We stop the train of stimuli and we find that our transmembrane electrode, microelectrode, recorded faithfully the action potentials during the stimuli and records now, after the train of stimuli, a totally spontaneous series of beats at a rate of a couple per second. So it is a ventricular tachycardia. And it's striking to notice that each of the action potential sits on a slowly rising transient. And when the train stops, you see that the slowly rising transient actually is a DAD. And that DAD accompanies the contractile event, the force event, that reflects the existence of a traveling contractile wave. Does that reflect a traveling calcium transient? Well, the proof is in eating the pudding. Measure calcium. On the left bottom, you have an image of one of these tuberculae loaded with Fura2. Left bottom, oops, sorry, still burning. Here's one of these tuberculae loaded with Fura2 by microelectrode with the sulfur. Now we average the image here, we get a reference image 360 nanometer illumination. And then we make a whole series of images at 380, and we make ratio images, and here's the end result calibrated. In the vertical direction, colored, you'll find the calcium transient as a function of time, and the long axis of the muscle is the axis disappearing in the screen. And in a normal muscle, you see that the calcium transient is uniform over about at least 8 cells, but more than that normally. And it's one transient, nothing more. Okay. What about muscles that make TPCs, trigger propagated contractions? Well, not a real surprise. They make calcium waves which travel from the damaged end to the other side of the muscle. So it's true, damage induces the occurrence of calcium waves. Calcium waves are coupled to arrhythmias. And if you stimulate that muscle a little faster, you elevate external calcium a little more, those waves go faster, last a shorter time, reach a higher peak, and make a larger DAD and trigger arrhythmias. So the text is self-explanatory, and the summary of that part of the discourse is that TBCs are initiated near stretched and damaged regions of myocardium. I didn't show this, but I'll show it in a moment. And they occur following the rapid release of that damaged and stretched part of the muscle. It's a very fundamental problem in this whole story, and that's the word damage. If I want to know the effect of damage on my finger, I cut the tip off. And that's an irreproducible experiment, because cutting another millimeter off is other damage. So I cannot reproduce my damage. And that was the problem in these experiments. So we had a brilliant Japanese postdoc who came in the lab, and we made together this setup. The easiest way to describe it is a jacuzzi bath, and you are the muscle. You are lying here in the bath. The tap water comes in here and flushes towards your feet and is sucked away there. Then you turn the jacuzzi jets on, and they hit, in this case, your arm. And you feel that, usually in a jacuzzi. It's quite a powerful jet of fluid. We make it so that it is a jet of fluid, but it won't perturb the muscle mechanically. It allows us to make a short stretch of muscle exposed to the solution that's in this pipette. And then we can look along that muscle with the Fura system in it, or with sarcomere length measurements using light diffraction. We can study that muscle in the presence of the jet being on or off. Well, the question about the jet stream in Calgary is quite obvious. At one moment in the day it can be minus 32, and 2 hours later it can be plus 16. So the jet stream by itself has a huge effect. What is the effect of the jet by itself in these muscles? Well, it's nil. No jet here for the development of a compressed charge factor there. Jet on, no change in force. If anything, there's a little increase. No change in shorten. If anything, there's a little more noise because the muscle may wiggle in the jet, and light diffraction through a wiggling grating is not perfect. If you add to the jet solution, otherwise being equal to the main bath, a paralyzer of contraction, BDM, butane-dione monoxide, which paralyzes the cross bridges, then you see an immediate effect. You see that force drops to about 60% of control force, and sarcomere length measured in the jet goes from a neat shortening pattern to a pure stretch pattern. And when you turn the jet off, you reverse that situation in a couple of minutes. So what happens if we use 3 tricks to make the muscle segment inside the jet weak? The 3 tricks are low calcium, depleting as are from calcium by using caffeine or by paralyzing the contractile system? The answer to what happens is here. Force is depressed, force is depressed, and force is depressed, and shortening in each case goes to stretch. And is that localized, that phenomenon? Yes. Here you are, the jet is here, and in the jet region, sarcomere shortening, as indicated by difference between the squares and the circles, turns to stretch. Next to the jet, there is a transition period where there is an isometric contraction, and then distant from it are the powerful sarcomeres in the normal valve. And that behavior is quite consistent between the three interventions. Now that gives us, luckily, the opportunity to replace chopping my finger off by a more manageable intervention in order to ask what happens when you have strong Japanese guys and a couple of weak Canadians when they are in a tug of war. Of course, my Japanese collaborator predicted the obvious. The weak Canadians lose. Man, they lose. And they say stretch of these caused by these guys will lead to lengthening of the sarcomeres in the weak area and in the border zone. And when they relax, these guys will flip back. And that allows us to ask whether the rapid shortening during the relaxation phase of these guys leads to the initiation of calcium waves. And that's the point of insight. Are there calcium waves initiated when you use this jet approach? Well, let me give one example, and it's the use of the BDM jet. Here you have the long axis of the muscle, horizontally time, and towards you, and in color, is calcium. And you see that in BDM, the calcium release occurs both outside and inside the jet. We know already that inside the jet, the folks are not contracting. And in the border zone, they are being stretched and then they shorten. And if you carefully look here, you'll find two light red peaks in the border zone. If you increase the ambient calcium level, you'll find that those peaks are now the beginning of calcium waves that travel away from that border zone. And we know that they travel away from that spot because they travel inward at even higher calcium. So the start of the V is the start of the calcium waves, being the border zone. And when do they make calcium transients? Well, you see here that they create calcium transients during or just upon the rapid relaxation phase of the twitch. That's the moment when the calcium transient of the propagating wave starts. So something during the relaxation phase of the twitch must initiate a calcium rise. And I'll make an argument that that is probably calcium coming off from troponin. But let's look at the events further. Here are the examples in the presence of caffeine, where the wave starts in the border zone and travels away, but not into the jet because there is no calcium in there to handle any propagation. Here is the example of BDM, you've seen that, and here's the example of low calcium. The LSR contains some calcium, and the wave propagates away from the border zone and slowly into the jet area. So each time it's the area where some contraction takes place, where the azar is filled with calcium, and where the tug of war leads to stretch and release of the sarcomeres. We keep that in mind for a moment. But a very important question is, does this game of playing with reversible non-uniformity in myocardium ever lead to arrhythmias? Well, the answer is yes. Let me start here on the right-hand side. If we take one of these muscles in the back, no jacuzzi yet with the one, then a train of stimuli will lead to a train of contraction followed by relaxation. And that will be repeated next time you try it, and try it, and try it, until you're sure that that is reproducible. And then we turn the jet on. What you'll find now is that the train of stimuli within a minute is followed by a spontaneous series of beats. There they are. Each of those beats rides on a after contraction here, and there, and there, and there, each one of them. So it is a TBC-related arrhythmia. That arrhythmia is completely reproducible. Each time we stimulate, we get an arrhythmia until you're bored stiff. And then we turn the jet off, and within a minute, the arrhythmia can never be reproduced anymore. So mechanical non-uniformity leads to the occurrence of calcium transients in the area where there are quick releases. That leads to propagating calcium waves, and that leads to arrhythmias. So what's the mechanism underlying this calcium surge in the border zone? I will have to be, in view of time, pretty short about that, but nearly all of you are modelers, so I can be short about it. And that is, I modeled calcium released by the enzyme. Calcium binding to the intracellular ligands, including troponin C. Calcium removal using known as our calcium uptake kinetics, as measured in the lab using saponin skin myocytes. And then I modeled, in addition to the conventional modeling, that calcium dissociation from troponin C decreases in proportion to force or to strain on activity. In other words, there's cooperativity between the mechanical event and calcium dissociation from TNC. And then I said, cross-bridge formation depends on the amount of calcium bound to TNC and, of course, on the number of attached cross-bridges. And the force depends on the single cross-bridge force, about 5 piconewtons, and the number of cross-bridges. Now you fill in all the high school stuff that comes out of the literature, the number of cross-bridges and binding coefficients and what have you, and the answer to the question then will be, do we match events of VC coupling, as summarized again here, and do we find that our data may be explained by a model that's depicted here. Calcium binds to troponin C. It's a little bleak here, but that is troponin C with calcium. When troponin C binds calcium, cross bridges attach, deform, and make force. when force is made, the actin filament is strained. When the actin filament is strained, troponin C will be distorted. And when troponin is distorted, the rate of dissociation of calcium slows down. When you take the force away, the rate of dissociation of calcium must accelerate again. So here are the results of a true experiment on tuberculosis and this modeling work. Modeling, the true experiment says here is sarcomere length and there is force development, and this is the force in a truly isometric contraction, which serves as a reference for experiment number 2, where you can drop force to 0 by very quickly releasing the sarcomeres even over about 100 nanometers. If you do it quickly, force drops to 0, and lo and behold, it recovers far too little compared to what it would have been without a quick release. So one question is, why is that? Well, the model may answer that. I used all the conventional data on calcium release and binding force development, and the resultant is here. Here's the calcium transient in the cytosol, including a plateau and a slow final part after 700 milliseconds. Here's the twitch force, which matches, I think you will agree quite nicely, experimental data. And here is the never measured troponin C calcium binding curve, which must be true because it has never been measured. And then the testable part is if we now impose at the same moment as in the experiment a quick release to reduce force to 0, what happens? Well, you see what happens. Force drops, of course, to 0, while troponin C loses much of its calcium, which is liberated into the cytosol in the form of this calcium surge. And the amplitude of that surge is about 100 nanomole. And the 100 nanomole rise of calcium should be able to trigger calcium release from the SR, which is recovered by that. And the recovery, final recovery of force is very modest, much like in the experimental case. So what we have now is a source of a calcium transient in the form of a calcium surge coming from the myofilaments, which may hit the ryanodine receptor and set off a propagated calcium wave. Last part is that in the case of making the muscle weak by exposing it in the jet to very high calcium levels, which causes spontaneous activity, as you see here in the jet, there is a period of spontaneous activity without propagation out into the neuronal muscle. If we use that paradigm to test whether our experimental conditions are sufficient to explain the observations, then we have had everything, and that is making a muscle weak by lowering calcium in the SR, by eliminating all calcium from the SR, and by paralyzing the clot bridges. Let's add to that series of experiments now an experiment where we make the muscle weak by having spontaneous activity in between heartbeats. that reduces force development, we know that. And the question is, will that generate calcium waves? The answer is yes. You see that calcium waves do occur in these high calcium experiments, and now they start in the place that is weakened, that has LSR which can release calcium, and the sarcomere-like data show that they start at the moment of the rapid release of sarcomeres and the rapid phase of decline of force development. In other words, the conditions are each time sufficient to make a case where we say, in the presence of a working LSR filled with calcium, a quick release, which does occur in non-uniform myocardium with weak areas and strong areas, creates a calcium surge, which then opens up ryanodine channels, which then let out calcium, which diffuses to adjacent LSR, and that leads to propagation of calcium waves. And of course, when calcium is released, the calcium is extruded by the sodium-calcium exchanger, leading to DADs and arrhythmias. So that by that, the cycle is closed, and mechanical non-uniformity seems to be a viable candidate. And that's the summary again, so I won't repeat it. I would like to thank you for listening to this story. Joran, thank you for having me here. All of you for teaching me during the day about what you have been doing. And I would like to thank my collaborators, including Dr. Boyden, Starfos, and Jura. I can go on for 10 more minutes. And granting agencies, AHFMR, the Alberta Heritage Foundation for Medical Research, they pay my salary. The Canadian Institutes of Health Research, NIH, Alberta Heart and Stroke Foundation, and the Janssen Research Foundation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a beautiful talk. So questions? Igor has a question.
Many questions. We will start one at a time. First question is, unfortunately we didn't get a chance to talk about it when we met today. One of the projects we are working on is related to shock-induced electroporation. And electroporation is essentially one of the ways to damage muscle in a repeated fashion as well. And it's quite localized. So when you apply even far-field shock, you can produce electroporation in a small region, which could be limited to just a couple of cell layers. And we've been looking for a number of years already, still not very successfully, for phenomenon shown earlier by, for example, several groups studying cell culture as well as papillary muscle, like Sulakadama showed in unselected papillary muscle. What they showed, if you apply stimulatory shock, which does induce electroporation, some cell length or age, you induce a very similar discharge of total arrhythmia. So we've always been thinking in terms of only purely ionic currents, but can you speculate if in any way your mechanism might be developed?
I think that the tempting answer is to say yes, of course. Electroporation means that you make holes that are big enough to allow virus in. I would surmise that a few calcium ions have no trouble getting into that hole. That means that in that cell, which is electroporated, there will be calcium loading and severe overloading if you do the electroporation experiments at normal ambient calcium levels of about 1.2 millimole. But if you lower them, there still will be loading because intracellular calcium is normally only 70 nanomole. So there will be uptake, entry of calcium. That will do two things. It will lead to accumulation of calcium in the NSR itself. And by a mechanism I didn't talk about, but which is implied in Wayne Shen's calcium overload induced calcium release, store overload induced calcium release, you would expect that the ryanodine receptor senses that high level of calcium enough to open up. And that would be equivalent to the triggered arrhythmia mechanism. When spontaneous diastolic calcium takes place, force of contraction is always reduced during the stimulated beat. That means that in those cells there will be an interaction with strong cells in series with them. They will lose the interaction, they will be stretched and quickly released, and that will then use the mechanism of reverse EC coupling to induce more calcium release. And as a matter of fact, you can see both phenomena here, because with severe calcium overload, you can see recurrent calcium release, which probably is for overload-related calcium release. Now, I would love to use the electroporation approach in these muscles if I could limit the extent of the damage to two cells along the muscle. Everywhere across the muscle, 2 cells long. Good. And I'll make notes.
Another question. Sorry. So you've investigated with BDM. And BDM is a normative of effect of many things, not only on cross bridges, but blocks pretty much every channel.
Yes.
And I noticed in some of the slides you had very high concentration, 20 millimolar BDM. We probably block almost entirely sodium channels, 75% of potassium channels, and calcium probably also 90%. Have you tried any more specific blockers like body statin, for example?
We have not used those yet. But then I agree with your assessment of BDM. It's a typical drug, which means it's dirty. There's many other effects than the one that you put in the paper. And one of the important ones is that BDM makes the NSR leaky for calcium in biochemical assays. So it could be a cause of calcium release, spontaneous calcium release. That probably does not play a role in these experiments, because in that case the calcium release would be inside the jet, where the BDM effect is the largest, and it never is inside the effect. As a matter of fact, when you apply BDM in these experiments with high calcium, the source of the calcium wave, the starting point, moves from inside the jet to the border of the jet again, advocating that the most important effect is the effect on cross bridges.
It seems like it's very localized, because outside this border zone, you have extra potentials with rising phases and repolarization phases. So all the ion channels outside the region where you apply the jet are not affected.
The worst I would say in that case is shown here. The jet is delineated by the yellow dashed lines, and you see the area of elevated calcium in the attack calcium experiment extends exactly 1 cell outside the jet.
So beyond that, it's really...
Beyond that, it should be fairly normal mouse.
No, if you
That's
release the
unfair.
jet suddenly, you're probably going to get this nice sharp rise in calcium, whereas if it's a little more gradual.
The rate of decline in the modeling work dictates the amplitude of the calcium surge. But only if you make the rate of decline very slow, the calcium surge falls below 50 nanomole. Very slow compared to what you see in the true experiment, where I don't control how quickly the sarcomeres shorten in the normal areas and thereby stretch the muscle segment in the jet. So I believe that experiment is more a reflection of what would happen in the heart, where one area of myocardium becomes ischemic and therefore loses the action potential plateau and therefore would have low calcium entry and rapid paralysis of the ischemic zone. And that ischemic zone then interacts with normal myocardium. But if you do the biophysical experiment where you say, okay, I have a motor that can go full swing in 150 microseconds, yeah, you'll get more calcium release. But you'll get it over the full range of speeds that we encounter in the contractile system. And to add to that argument, we have done experiments where we accelerated the release in these non-uniform muscles. And the answer was we got faster waves and more tendency to arrhythmias. Then we said we do the opposite. We stretch the muscle during the experiment and we allowed the motor to take up the release that you find otherwise. So we eliminated the quick release of the weak area. And we found that we reduced the amplitude of the calcium waves by up to 70%. So the mechanics are quite clearly playing a role and are within the time domain range that is normal for contracting muscle.
Okay, so
It struck me that I've always thought of something like commotio cordis, where a young person gets hit with a ball or something and they get an arrhythmia, that was due to some activation of stretch activated ion channels. I was wondering if this could play some role in that mechanism, where they get. I don't know much about it other than that a young person gets hit and they develop an arrhythmia.
Watching too much baseball. Of course, you're talking about a baseball, I guess.
Or a hockey puck, or
a hockey puck. Horrible. Well, I think first of all, in the rat, the role of stretch activated channels seems to be relatively small. Whenever we've done experiments testing the role of stretch activated channels in development of these TBCs, and we used absolutely pure drug of gadolinium, which inhibits stretch activated channels and a whole slew of others, plus calcium channels, the DHP receptor, and we found that we could literally mimic the observed effect of gadolinium by an equal force-depressing effect using nifedipine. So in the rat, it seems that stretch-activated channels can be neglected largely. I don't know whether that's true in humans, and if I would quote Max Lab or other people than Peter Cole, then he would advocate that stretch-activated channels may be important. That's possible. On the other hand, people who have studied stretch-activated channels have not studied possible implication of the contractile system. So I would be happy to leave both possibilities open and say, get out of the way when the puck is approaching.
What you need is baseball playing Reds. Train them a little while.
Okay.
Any other questions or comments to, well, if not, thank you so much again.
One more question about temperature range. So you observe your P.H.D. only during 27 degrees or during another temperature?
We spent a paper on that. We found that, that's maybe useful to add. All these phenomena do occur in the case of damage. We didn't test it with these jets. All these phenomena do occur at body temperature. And the only difference between body temperature and 25 degrees or 26 is that cells lining the damaged area seal off more quickly at body temperature, seem to seal off. So the time you have to study the phenomenon is less. And then one additional comment, we studied the induction of TBCs in atrial trabecular of human, and we found a very similar behavior of the human trabecular. So I didn't mention that here, but I should have. Of all the maybes, the maybe it's applicable to the human scenario is a definite maybe.
Okay, thank you so much.